Parshas Vayikra in the book of Vayikra. And it begins, if you notice the first word, there's a problem with the first word. What?
No.
The aleph in the word is very small. You see that? It has the same size as the rest of the word. Vayikra and called, and right, God calls to Moshe, and he says the word Vayikra, the first word there, it has an aleph as the last letter, and in the Torah itself, just like here, the aleph is very small compared to the rest of the word. It's as if somebody's typing and they hit the wrong button and they made it very small. So why is that? So everybody talks about it, and they ask this question, and the commentaries say that if you look ahead in the Torah, you'll see where God calls Bilam. Bilam is a non-Jewish prophet, right? And God has an interaction with him. Now he's a prophet who's not a very good person. He basically used his prophetic abilities to make money. Whoever would pay him the most money, he would curse their enemies for them, right? So it says there, Vayikra, that God came across him, right? And here it says Vayikra, and God called to Moshe. Now the difference between the two is the letter aleph. In the case of Bilam, there's no aleph, because it doesn't mean he called there. It means he happened to see him. Right? It means happenstances. Coincidentally, happen to be it's like it's one thing if I make an appointment to go out to lunch with you. Another thing is if I happen to go to the restaurant and you're sitting there by yourself. So I happen to see you, so we have lunch together. Right? It's very different. One of them is a plan, one is not a plan. In the case of Moshe, God very with a very specific plan calls out to Moshe to teach him something. In the case of Bilam, they're telling you that God is showing a disrespect to him. He doesn't even have enough respect for Bilam, who was a sellout, that he would even make an appointment with him. It just happens I see him, so since I see him, I'm going to talk to him, so to speak. So what's it got to do with here? That you have a small aleph. The reason is that when Moshe wrote down the Torah, it says that Moshe didn't want to have the aleph here. He did not want to be treated different than Bilam. He felt that compared to God, God looks at a prophet like Bilam and says, he compared to me, to God, who's all-knowing, he's insignificant. So Moshe says, well, I'm also insignificant, because Moshe was very humble. Who am I compared to God? So I want to be called the same way God calls Bilam. It just happens to be. Right? It happens to be that he comes across me. Same with me. Why should God treat me any better? Right? That's how he felt. He was humble about it. So if that's the case, he has a good reason, right? So you say, so why didn't God let him do it? It says God told him, add the aleph. Right? Put an aleph in. I don't want you to consider yourself like Bilam. And so the fact is that God wants to teach us a very important message here, which is why he allows him to make the aleph small. Because by making the aleph small, it makes us ask the question. That Moshe says, because of humility, because I want to be humble, I want to be compared to even Bilam. Therefore, I don't want to be called by a different word, where God thinks I'm more important than him. I want to be called the same way. And God says, no, you can't, so put the aleph back. So Moshe says, okay, I will, but I want to make the aleph small. So why does God just not say, no, you can't? You are not going to be like Bilam. Forget the small aleph. Forget no aleph. You're Moshe. You're the greatest prophet who ever lived. I'm not going to allow that to happen. But he allows him to make the small aleph. And the point is like this. What the real meaning is of the fact that there's no aleph in the word when it talks about Bilam is that it's saying, I just happened to see you. Right? God doesn't make an appointment to see Bilam. He just happens to run into him, so to speak. It's happenstance. It's coincidence. In the case of Moshe, God very planfully wants to see Moshe. And this is an important point because the world believes in coincidence. The world that we live in believes in happenstance, things that just happen. I happen to be driving down the road, and this drunk driver just happened to be driving by, and he sideswiped me. It's happenstance. There's no meaning behind it. There's no reason. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. If I had the other half of my bagel, I would have been 5 minutes later, and I wouldn't have been hit. That's happenstance. We don't believe in happenstance. Jews don't believe that things happen because they happen. We believe that if something happens, there's a reason that it happens. Everything that happens in our lives and everything that happens in the world is planned by God. Right? God wants certain things to happen. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have free will. We can choose to do things, but there are specific things that God wants to happen to us, and then we have the free will as to how to act. We can get upset, we can get angry, we can not do what we're supposed to do. We can do it. We can, right? We can be driving down the road and we look over to the right, and there's a person on the side of the road, and they're looking for a ride. Right? So we can look the other way and ignore them and not give them a ride. We can stop and give them a ride. We could say, you know what, I'm afraid this person is frightening looking. I don't know them. It's not worth it. I shouldn't give them a ride. We have lots of things that we can do. So the fact that God causes us to come into a situation where we see this person and this person needs something, now that's because there's no happenstance, because everything is planned. How we react to it, do we pick the person up? We don't pick the person up. What do we do? That's our choice, right? But nothing is happenstance. Nothing is coincidence, and nothing just happens because it happens. If Moshe would be allowed to use the expression Vayikra, right, which means it was happenstance that God saw Moshe, so then he'd be sending us a wrong message. Therefore, God tells Moshe, yes, you have to add the aleph, but you can make the aleph small, because I want you to make sure that people know, the Jewish people know, that whatever happens to them as individuals, as a nation, as a community, happens for a reason. Nothing's coincidence. And that's why it's in our belief and our understanding, a word that we don't use is coincidence. We don't use such an expression. Things just don't just happen. And, what a coincidence, I happen to run into you. Right? There's no such thing. There's a reason that you meet who you meet. There's a reason why you are where you are. There's a reason that today you went to the restaurant to have lunch and the waitress was rude. There's all the reason, and it's all there to see how you will react. Right? Nothing is happenstance. Nothing is coincidence. So God wants us to learn that lesson. The way we learn the lesson is by He allowed Moshe to make the aleph small, so that we would see that there is something funny going on here, and we would ask this question. And that's why it's there. So it's an important point that we need to keep in mind, that in our understanding of the world, nothing happens by chance. It all happens for a reason. That you met the person that you married, that wasn't just by chance, it was for a reason. You went to the yeshiva or the school that you went to for a reason. You interacted with someone, or you dated somebody to get married for a reason. Nothing is happenstance. Nothing is simply, I ran into them. But I know of a story of a family that they had this young man was suggested to them to date their daughter to get married. And so they looked into it, and they said, well, we don't think this is a good one. This is good for us. Whatever reason, not necessarily anything wrong with him. It was just not for our daughter. You can't marry anybody. You have to marry somebody who fits. So we don't think it'll work. So they turned it down. And about 9 months later, somebody came back with the same guy again, a different family. They handed them and said, listen, this guy seems perfect for your daughter. What do you think? And they said, no, you wouldn't know this, but they came to us earlier, and it's not good. And then, about 4 months after that, they're going to go to Israel, and they're waiting in line, and it's these long lines going in the airport, and who's in front of them is this guy, and this guy doesn't know who they are, so they're watching him, and they see that even with all of the anxiety that these long lines cause, and the way that they're treated very often in the lines, he's acting very nicely, and he's treating people with respect. And they say, you know what? Maybe we should reconsider. Maybe we were wrong. We were too quick to decide that he's not for our daughter. And then they let him date her, and they got married. And it turns out, now, was it happenstance, coincidence that they happened to run into him? Clearly not. The first time somebody came to them, so they had a chance to decide that this is for their daughter. They decided not. They have that right. Because someone comes again. Now they should say, that's interesting. Why are two people who aren't related to each other coming to us with the same young man? And nevertheless, maybe to the outsider they seem similar, but we know better. So then finally, after it gets to the point where God says, all right, listen, you're not going to listen to my messengers, so you're going to have to listen to me. So God makes it so that they themselves come into contact with him in a way that he doesn't realize it, and yet he acts in a superlative, wonderful, sophisticated manner, and they say, we were mistaken. Right? So this shows you that in the world we live in, there is no coincidence. It's just that God is very subtle, and it could take him hundreds of years to cause something to happen so that you'll meet somebody. Generations. Somebody, you could have, you come from South Africa, right, and you come to Canada, and another family comes from Russia, and they come to Canada. And you imagine how much had to go into the fact that these families both ended up in the same city, one from South Africa and one from Russia, and yet suddenly they meet and their two children get married. Right? That just doesn't happen. Right? God manipulated going all the way back that this should happen. Now, it wasn't just for this reason, but it was a reason. So that's why it's important to note that in our belief system, there's no such thing as coincidence. There's no thing as happenstance. Things don't just happen. We have the free will to affect it, but God wants certain things to happen, and then we need to deal with it. So that's how our parsha begins, right? That Vayikra Moshe, God calls out to Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem. So now we have another funny thing about this sentence. It begins with, and God calls out to Moshe, and God speaks to him, right? And the Ohel Moed Lemor, to say. So you have the word say, like talking, 3 times. Vayikra, right here it means he calls. Vayidaber, and he speaks. Lemor, and he talks. All 3 are the same idea, right? Why does it say so many times? So from this, I saw in the Chafetz Chaim, one of the great rabbis of the previous generation, who spent much of his time dealing with the ideas of speaking nicely about people, about Lashon Hora. And he says here that this is one of the proofs that if somebody comes and tells you something, and if they don't tell you or make it known to you that you can tell this to other people, you should keep it a secret. You shouldn't tell people. Sometimes somebody confides in you or they tell you something. It's not necessarily for everyone to know. It's for you to know. They want to talk to you about it. They have a relationship with you. They like you. Whatever the reason is, they're telling you, but they don't want to tell everybody. But often we don't necessarily realize that. And we'll tell people. Someone says, my daughter's about to get engaged, or my son is about to get engaged, or my daughter-in-law is going to have a baby. Right? Not everybody's going to know this, and you happen to tell somebody, or somebody tells you. So how do you know what you should do about it? So he says that this line in the Torah tells you. The reason it says that God calls out to Moshe, and he says to him, and then he tells him, and then tell the others. I'm calling you, God says, and I'm telling you this. Now tell the others. By virtue of the fact that he says so many times, I called you, I told you, now you tell, tells you that in this case Moshe is supposed to tell people. But if it doesn't say that, you're not supposed to tell people. So therefore, if someone comes to you and they tell you something that could be a private idea, we have to presume it is. Unless we know that it's not private. Right, then it's different. If somebody tells you, hey, did you see me in the newspaper? Clearly that's not private. Anybody who buys a newspaper is going to see it. Right? So there you can talk about it. But in a case like this, right, if somebody comes and tells you something, and even if it's good news, my daughter is about to get engaged, so then you've got to say, hey, I shouldn't be telling people. Let them tell people. They want to tell people. So I don't. And this is, according to Chafetz Chaim, is where we get this idea. And then it says, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people and tell them, Adam ki yakriv mekem korban, a man who gives among you a sacrifice. Now, interestingly enough, this idea is going to go at length in the next number of weeks, this whole idea of sacrifices. So first let's define a sacrifice, and then we're going to talk about some of the different ones and why the wording in the Torah changes. Firstly, what is a sacrifice? Right, as most of us can picture, at least I, growing up here in North America, I can picture when I talk about a sacrifice, I think of these Tarzan movies where they would be in Africa and he would go into a cave, and I don't know how they did this, but they have like 10,000 of the natives from Africa in this cave worshiping some idol. And they're all in, I don't know how they all got into a cave and nobody knew it, but they're all in this, 10,000 of them are in this cave, and there's all these torches everywhere, and they're bowing down to an idol. And then they take a person and they offer that person as a sacrifice. Or even they take an animal and they offer the animal as a sacrifice. What are they trying to do? They're basically saying the God is either hungry in some way, or this God is vengeful. He wants us to take something that we care about, something that has meaning to us. Either it's expensive, like a cow, and or it's dear to us, like a human, like a child, somebody's relative, and you be prepared to waste it. Sacrifice it. That's what you're doing. You're saying, here's $10,000. I'm going to burn the cash on this right here on the altar. I'm going to take $10,000 and burn it because I love you, God, so much. I'm ready to burn $10,000. That's what a sacrifice always was. They would take a human being and they'd say, this God is vengeful. He wants blood. So we're going to kill this human being who we love so that God will do something for us. Right? We're bribing the God. But that's what a sacrifice was. That is true. That's what the word sacrifice means. That you give up something, and in most cases you waste it. It's gone from you. But that's not what our word means. When we talk about a sacrifice, that's really a very poor translation of the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is karban, and it comes from the root word is karev, for close. Someone who's close to you, for instance, a relative are kruvim. Those are relatives. They're close to you. Right? If you want to get close to someone, right, I am becoming karev. I'm getting close to you. I'm standing next to you. That's close to you. I'm getting closer to you. Like you tell somebody, where are you? Well, I'm driving towards you. You say, I am being karev. I'm getting closer to you. So the word karban, which the root word is to get close, is that this object, which logically should have no effect, this object will bring me close to God. So this cow, for instance, I'm going to offer this cow to God. Now, in 90% of the times, even more than 90%, when we offer a sacrifice, we don't do like those people in the cave where they take the animal or the person and they put them on a fiery altar and they burn them into ashes. We don't do that. We say that you take a cow and we bring it to the temple and we bring it to the Kohen, and the Kohen kills it in a certain way and does certain rituals with parts of it, takes certain parts of it and disposes of it, and now you have this majority of a cow. And he basically barbecues it. He cooks it on the altar, right? He cooks the cow on the altar. A portion of the cow goes to the Kohen, right? That he has to get paid. I mean, he's working there, so he gets a portion of the cow, and you get a portion of the cow, and let's say your friends or other Kohanim, depending on the type of sacrifice. And what do? You sit down and you eat it. That's what you do. You eat the cow, so, right? And this brings you closer to God. So that's what the idea of a sacrifice is for us. Why is that? Because the whole concept of sacrifice is the wrong translation for us. That's just an English word. It doesn't mean the same idea. With a sacrifice is you're taking something and you're wasting it, and you're saying, God, I love you so much and I'm prepared to give this up for you, and therefore you should do what I want. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that this animal, right, is we are offering it on the altar, and a portion of it goes to the poor, and a portion of it goes to the Kohen, and a portion of it goes to me, and a portion of it to my friends or my family. When we eat this animal, we are then becoming uplifted and becoming closer to God. We are eating it in the temple. It's done in a very ritualistic and very pure manner, and with very precise thoughts. And therefore, what it does is it brings you close to God. It helps you in your goal of being close to God. Now, if you feel, for instance, let's say if one of the sacrifices we give is for sinning. If you do something wrong. So let's say a person does something wrong. They feel it, and now they feel orphaned from God. They're estranged from God. God said, don't do this, and yet I did it. So we have that distance. So that we say, no, that's not. That you can't say that way. A korban, a sacrifice, can help bring you closer. So that person has to offer a sacrifice, and by doing so, together with their right frame of mind, with their own personal effort to improve themselves, with real regret not to do that sin again, then the sacrifice can help them become close to God. Right? Today we don't have these sacrifices, but this is how they were done. So you have many, many different sacrifices, and it's not at all like the idea is in the movies or in any other religion besides Judaism. By the way, just to give you an idea about that, it says that sacrifices have to be offered by Jews, Jewish sacrifices. And it was the Jew would come and give it to the Kohen would do it. But it says that there's actually sacrifices that non-Jews could give. And there were times, we're told, during the first temple, when King Solomon was so powerful that kings and others from other countries would come to Israel and would offer sacrifices to the Jewish God, out of respect to the powerful Jews and to God.
What does Hashem think?
What do you mean?
About when an English person comes and just, when they cut it up and...
They don't cut it up. They came just like we did, and they gave it to the temple, and the temple took care of it. So the idea was a non-Jew could offer a sacrifice, but the only sacrifice a non-Jew could offer was a sacrifice that was offered in the temple, just like us, but it was totally burnt on the altar. They couldn't eat it, and nobody else could eat it. And that was because in the mind, if you look at all the religions of the world, this is very clear. In the mind of the non-Jewish world, a sacrifice is exactly how I described it. Is you're wasting something. You're giving something up because you love God so much, and you're appeasing God by giving it to Him. So their mind could not comprehend the idea that I'm going to take this cow, I'm going to donate it to the temple, and then I'm going to eat it. How is that doing something for God? It didn't make sense. There's no religion other than ours that says that. So understanding that this is something that's in the DNA of human beings. So God says, yeah, they can give sacrifices, and they can give sacrifices to God, to our own God, but the only one they can give is the one that's burnt, because that's what they understood, and we understand it in a very different way. So now, when the Torah starts talking about it here, the first example, it says, Adam ki yakriv mekem korban lashem. Right, a man who will be brought close, right, by sacrificing a sacrifice to God, mina behema, mina bakar. It can be a cow, it can be sheep, it can be all different types of animals, right? They can be your korban. Now here, if you notice, where it talks about a man, here it says Adam. That's the word for man, right? There are many words for a human. It doesn't mean a man like male. It means a human. So Adam is one. Now later on, if we look on the next page on 548, beginning 3 lines from the bottom, or 549, 2 lines from the bottom, here it says, "V'nefesh ki takriv korban mincha," when a person offers a meal offering to Hashem. Now you compare that to the wording we just said, which was when a man. There it's a man, here it's a person. Now in Hebrew the difference is much more significant than I just said in English, because if you look in the original one it says Adam, right, talking about a human, and in the Hebrew version for the second one it says nefesh. Now nefesh is the life force inside of you, it's your soul. Now we have many aspects to our soul. You have a spiritual ability, that's called your neshama. And you have a life force, so it makes your heart beat, your blood flow. All right, when a person dies, their nefesh disappears from them, right? That's what keeps you alive. So if you want to refer to a person, you can call a person a person. You can call him a man. You can call him by his gender. You can call a person a soul. Right? They do it in English. There's 5 souls here, meaning to say that they're living entities. So the first place it says a man who gives a sacrifice. Then here it says a soul that gives a sacrifice. What's the difference? Why does the Torah change the word? Why doesn't it use the same word all the time for a person? So one of the differences in the first case is talking about a person who gives an animal. It says, right, Adam ki yakriv, a man who gives a sacrifice, a behema, right? It says here, cattle or from their flocks, right, as some type of an animal. In the second case that we said, where it says nefesh, the soul, it says korban mincha. Korban mincha is a flour offering, made out of flour, made like wheat. Right, so the difference is the first case where it's called a man, it's talking about giving an animal. The second case is called a soul, it's talking about giving flour. What's the difference in the 2 cases? In general, a middle class or wealthy person, when they had to give a sacrifice, they'd give an animal. Imagine an animal's got to cost today $3,000 for a cow. I mean, they're not cheap. It's got to be real money, right? So you're not going to have a poor person has to give a sacrifice just like a rich person. Right? So if a rich person gives, so he's going to go and he's going to, he wants to improve, so he'll go and spend $3,000 on a sacrifice. He'll eat some, the Kohen will eat some, but he'll spend the money. A poor man can't. So he'll give a sacrifice made out of flour. He's allowed to. God wants sacrifices from anybody who needs to. The fact that you don't have money doesn't mean you shouldn't give one. So God says, so you can give flour. Flour costs a few cents. How much could it cost? $1, right? So he pays. One guy pays, $3,000. One guy pays $2. Right now, and the one who pays $3,000 is called a man, and the one who pays like $1, he's called a soul. So you shouldn't think it should be the other way around. A guy who spends a lot of money on a sacrifice, right, of an animal, that person should be called a soul. A soul is a higher level than a man, right? It's looking at the spiritual side. The guy who gives just a couple of pennies for some flour, he should be called a man, not a soul. He's at a lower level, especially since the animal itself. One of the ideas of giving an animal is that when you go to the temple and you see them slaughter the animal, which is something we don't see very often today, right? You see it, you realize suddenly how similar on a physical level I am to that animal. I have a heart, it has a heart. I have a stomach, it has a stomach. I have blood, it has blood. You cut me, I cry. You cut it, it cries. Right? You see a similarity, and you say, except for the grace of God, that would be me. I sinned against God. God created me. If I go against him, for all rights, he could kill me. I'm not doing what he wants me to do. He created me. He created me with a purpose. The fact that he doesn't, right, is a blessing for us. But if it wasn't for that, you see that animal and how he looks, that could be me, right? But if you do it with flour, a little bit of honey or whatever, and you offer that, you can't say that would be you. It doesn't look like us. It doesn't make you feel the same way, right? So you'd say then the guy who gives the sacrifice of the animal, he's at a higher level. He should be the soul. The one who gives less should be called the man. But it's the opposite. Why does the Torah do that? So it appears that the Torah is telling us that the sacrifice of the poor man is considered a higher sacrifice than the sacrifice of the wealthy man. Because why the wealthy man gives the cow, he's called a man. Because the poor man gives some wheat, some flour, he's called a soul. So you think it's a higher level. It's not innately true. But there's a lesson to be learned in this. And that lesson is that very often a wealthy person can spend $3,000 and it's not a big effect on him. It's like sometimes when you raise money, like if I raise money for the shul, there are some people I go to and they'll give me a donation and that affects exactly how they live their life. If I go to them and they give me a $180 check, they will have to buy less groceries that week. I don't mean, poor people, middle class people who live on what they raise, the money that they bring in, they live on it. So if you give me a $100 donation this week, you have $100 less to spend, right? You have other people who are wealthy. If they give me a $100 donation, they give me a $1,000 donation, it won't affect how they live. Then when it comes out of their savings or out of their assets or out of their trust funds, right, it's different. Not that it's not important, it's important. And not that they could say no. They should we appreciate it in any case. But how much of effect did the giving actually have on the person? Chances are a wealthy person who gives a cow that costs $3,000 probably has less of effect on his day-to-day living than a poor person giving a handful of flour, which costs him $1.50. A poor person, $1.50 could be his whole week's pay, all the money he has for a week, while a rich person just takes it out of an account. So, and that's what the Torah is telling us. Not literally is the sacrifice of a poor person by definition better than a rich person. That's not true. But we need to know a lesson. It's not the cost of the sacrifice that makes it work. That's not what makes it important. That's not what makes it significant. It's the commitment. It's the effect on us. That we're actually going to give from ourselves because I want to become close to God again. I did something wrong and I distanced myself from God. I want to become close again. I'm prepared to do whatever I need to do. So I have to give a sacrifice? Well, God only gave me $500 a month to live on. So I can't give $3,000. I don't have it. So I give a sacrifice, but that sacrifice of flour affects me. I can't buy milk this week because of it. I can't buy chicken this week because of it. But I care that much. I'm prepared to do that. While the rich person might also care a lot. I'm not saying that they don't, but by definition it's telling you that the poor person's gift has more of an effect on him than the rich person's gift. And therefore the rich person is called a person. Right? A person. He's a good person, a holy person. He's doing it, wants to be close. But the poor person, by definition, is called a soul, because that person has an effect directly on their soul simply by doing this. And again, it's not across the board. You can have poor people who it has no effect on, and rich people it has a great effect on. But it's giving you a concept. It's not the price of the sacrifice that's important. It's the effect of the sacrifice that's important. Yeah?
Or you sort of touched on it, when you were talking, I couldn't understand how exactly you'd be closer to God, but I understood you were talking about how if you, slay the animal, the person you think, Hashem could do that to me, right?
Well, it's a bit more than that. You see, the way that a person becomes close to God by offering a sacrifice is that you have also you have to affect yourself, your personality. In other words, when I offer the sacrifice for doing something wrong, I don't just give a sacrifice. That's the last step. First thing is I have to regret what I did. I have to then commit that I'll never do it again. And then I give the sacrifice. If I really feel within my heart, let's say I went and I wasn't careful and I wasn't thinking and I went and I ate food that wasn't kosher. And whatever reason, I was very hungry and I wasn't thinking and I did it and I ate it. I purposely, whatever you want, we can make up whatever story we want. But I ate food that wasn't kosher. And then I realized the next day, what did I do? I ate food that's not, am I crazy? I can't do that. And I feel really bad that I did it, and I'm regretful, and I say, I am never going to do that again. Now, if I go and offer a sacrifice at that point, God will atone, the sacrifice will atone, because my mental state has already accomplished bringing me closer. But if I don't do that, all I do is, all right, I did it. If I give a sacrifice, everything will be fine. It won't be fine. Nothing will happen. It's the same thing with us today. Today, when we do something wrong, we do the process called tshuva. Tshuva is to return to where we were, close to God. So that we say, how could I do that? I did X, Y, or Z wrong. How could I do such a thing? I will never do it again. Now today we don't have a sacrifice to finalize it. So today, like according to the Rambam, is I have to then be in this similar situation again and not do it. And that shows that I've changed. And therefore, that works in that way. But if you don't have the thought process and the commitment, then the sacrifice won't do you any good. And just like today, if we go into Yom Kippur without evaluating ourselves and how we have improved, and how we don't want to get worse, and we evaluate any error that we've done and try to help ourselves, then Yom Kippur will atone for us. But if we just go into Yom Kippur like we're asleep, it's not going to really do that much for us. It will. There is a certain amount of atonement, but it won't work in the same way. There's the same thing here. So that's why as we skipped ahead, we see the two different types of words used for people here. Now this goes through, even going back and going forward, all of the details of what happens, and we don't really need to go into it, but there's certain fat is burnt on the altar, certain fat is thrown away. But what to know about this is maybe people don't realize that when we eat an animal today, right, there are laws about certain parts of the animal we can't eat. Just like there are certain animals you can't eat. There are certain parts of an animal that you can eat. Those certain parts you can't eat. So for instance, you will very rarely ever find that you can get the back half of a cow today. The back part of a cow today is like a T-bone steak comes from the back of a cow. You're never going to find a kosher T-bone steak here. Because what happens is there are certain fats within an animal which we're not allowed to eat. There are certain veins, even nerves that we're not allowed to eat. And the most commonly known one is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve in an animal is the nerve that, remember the story of Jacob, that he wrestled with the angel, and it says, and until this day, as a reminder of this, we will not eat this nerve at all. So in a cow, it has the sciatic nerve just like we have. It's a very large nerve. In our case, this could be as thick as your thumb. It goes down your leg, right from your back down your leg. So that same one in a cow, we're not allowed to eat. But if we could find a way to cut it out, we could eat the back of the cow. We just can't eat that nerve. The fact is that we don't know. The Ashkenazi tradition has lost the knowledge how to correctly take that out of the animal. and it's been like that for centuries. So we don't know how to do it anymore. So what we do is when we get an animal and we shecht it and it's kosher, so they take the back half of the animal and they sell it to the non-Jews, right? In other words, like you could have a slaughterhouse that has a kosher area and a non-kosher area. So the front of the animal will go to the kosher and the back of it will go to the non-kosher. With the Sephardic Jews, they believe that they do have the tradition and it's an act and they can follow straight through till today, and they can take out those parts of the backside. And so if you're Sephardic and you follow this tradition, you'd be able to eat those parts of the animal, except for right in those certain area where that nerve is and where the forbidden fats are. It talks here about the fats and the nerves and stuff. That's why I'm making reference to it. So that that's why we find, if you go into one of the stores here, you're never going to find anything that comes from the back of an animal. If you go to Montreal, where they have a larger Sephardic community, in that community you'll actually find it. Now, if you want to know, are we allowed to eat it? As Ashkenazim, we're not supposed to eat it because we don't have the knowledge as a tradition. So therefore, the fact that they do, we don't tell them that they don't. They do. They have it. But we don't believe that we have it, so therefore we can't eat from there. We can't eat it from them. But we don't tell them that they're wrong, because they're not wrong. It's just that we don't have that tradition. Right? It's just like you have it in many places. For instance, the Yemenites, they have a letter that is pronounced J. We don't have any letter in the Hebrew alphabet that sounds like a J. There's no such letter. They have the letter Gimel. If you put a dot in the Gimel, just like we have a dot in the Shin, it becomes a Sin, right? And a Tuf becomes a Suf. So they have it. A Gimel, it goes from a Gimel to a Gimel. You have a Gimel and a Gimel. We don't have such a thing. But they have a tradition, and it could be their tradition is more pure. Ours might have become corrupted, right? More so than theirs. But they have this. We don't have it anymore. So when we see a Gimel with a dot, do we pronounce J? No, we don't. Does that mean that they're wrong when they do? No, it doesn't mean that. That's their tradition. So it's the same idea, right? They have different traditions. The traditions have accuracy, but even if your tradition is, you can see perhaps is not as pure as the other one, we can't change it, right? Traditions have very importance to us. Yes.
Back in Ukraine, my grandmother told that one of our relatives was menaker. He was knowing how to take this mankur, this nerve, called mankur. And it was very common back in Ukraine and Poland to have the shoftim who were known.
Well, there is in our tradition, we do have people who are menaker, who take out the nerve, but they don't. That traditionally they don't take out that nerve. That they didn't know how to do that one nerve. Could be, maybe you had people who did, but our belief in the Ashkenazic world for centuries is that we can take out certain nerves and we can take out certain fats, but we can't, that one we don't know how to do. Only the Sephardim. Maybe there were people that did, but traditionally we didn't know that in the whole. But it could be. So now we have the sacrifice of flour and spice and so forth. So let's look on to another one. Another sacrifice that we should look at is if we go into on 552 and 553. Here it says, "V'im zevach shlamim karbano." Here's if his offering is a feast peace offering, right? And then it tells you how he offers the sacrifice. What does that mean, right? A peace offering. So here, a peace offering is an offering that is brought to cause peace between God and us. That is to say, something happened that we feel that there's a rift between God and us. But we have to understand an important point, that while we feel that, it's not necessarily true. In other words, a child, let's make a difference between a child and a spouse, right? If a spouse does something, really destructive in our marriage, so it could destroy the marriage, and people get divorced. And there's somebody that goes and has an affair. It could destroy a marriage, and they get divorced. If a child goes and does something that's really terrible, really against everything you believe in, they're still your child, and it doesn't really change. Even though you might, maybe you don't like them very much at this point, but you still have love for them, it doesn't go away. It's always there, right? When we do something that's wrong or distances us from God, we feel that we need to make peace with God. Like a husband needs to make peace with a wife, and a wife needs to make peace with a husband. But in God's eyes, there's no. It's really not the case. Certainly, we have to become closer. But God's relationship to us is like a parent to a child, which is He's not going to send us away, so to speak. He's not going to destroy our relationship because we do something wrong. It doesn't mean that we can do something wrong, because the reason that we feel it is because in the world that we live in, the physical world, we understand that we need to get closer to God. But God understands, you're my children, right? I don't want you to do anything that's harmful for you, but even if you do, I'm not going to send you away. You're not going to be gone from me, right? It's like when the Jews when the temple was destroyed and they were sent off to Babylon, which today is Iraq. So they were sent off there, and they had to. While they were there, they lost the temple. They were slaves, and here they are. They're living there, and they went to the rabbis and they said, "You know what? It looks like the game's over. Judaism's finished because God and us, we made a deal. We have a covenant with God, and the covenant is we'll follow the Torah. He'll take care of us. Right? That's the deal. We stopped following the Torah. God threw us out of the land of Israel. So that means that we didn't do our side of the deal." God sent us out of Israel. He's telling us He's not doing His side of the deal. We're not guarded anymore. So it's finished. Judaism's over. We blew it. Right? So the prophet who they said this to says back to them, so show me your divorce papers. Show me your get. If God has divorced you, then show me your get. You have to show me a get. And they feel, well, of course we don't have a get. What God's going to write us a get. So He says, then you're not. Then it's not true. And that's the point. That no matter what we do, God will never send us away to the point where there's no coming back. We have to try to get closer, but God will never reject us fully, because that was a promise He made to us. In fact, you can see an interesting point with this. If you've gone through this whole section, which I know we haven't, we've been skipping, but one thing that we find in almost every sacrifice, or if not that, every sacrifice, it says that they should be offered with salt. You should offer the sacrifice of this, 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 and this. You shouldn't have honey. You shouldn't have this. You shouldn't have that. But on every sacrifice, there should be salt. That's what it says. Now you have it here on 552. You see the word salt there. You shall salt your every meal offering. All right. What is this idea of using salt as in our sacrifices? What's the purpose of it? We also find this expression back in the book of Bereshit, where the covenant that I just spoke about, the business arrangement, so to speak, between us and God, we follow the Torah, God takes care of us, is referred to as a bris melech, a covenant of salt. So he's developed all the things. You think salt is sort of a funny thing. Why would God say he has a covenant of salt? It can be a covenant of sugar. Maybe it tastes good. It's sweet. When we're together, we're sweet together. But a covenant of salt is funny. So to understand it, I'll tell you a story from the Talmud. The Talmud has this very interesting story about the wise Greek philosophers having discussions with the rabbis. Right? The great philosophers of the day would come and discuss with the rabbis to try to prove their point, that the Jews should be Hellenists. They should follow the Greek world, and therefore the rabbis would sort of play with the Greek philosophers. They would have these conversations. The Greek philosophers would try to outwit them to show that Judaism is not true and you should follow us. And the rabbis would sort of play around. They'd talk to them, but they weren't going to buy it. So one of the stories says the following: that the Greek philosopher goes to the rabbi and says, "When salt spoils, what do you salt it with?" And now, what's the question? Because salt is a preservative. Before you had refrigerators, if you had meat, you didn't want it to get ruined, you salted the meat, and it would cause it to be preserved. So salt was a preservative. So when salt spoils, what do you salt it with? Right? When meat spoils, what do you do? Well, to keep it from not spoiling is you salt it. So what happens when salt itself is spoiled? How do you preserve it? What do you do? That's the Greek's question to the rabbis. It's absurd, right? So what do the rabbis say? It says you use the afterbirth of a mule. That's what the rabbis say back. You use the afterbirth of a mule.
But mule cannot give birth.
So that's true. So you have to. Salt can't spoil. So the Greeks say, well, yeah, a mule is sterile. You can't have children. So the rabbis say back to them, well, who says salt spoils? Right? You rabbis always ask questions with questions, right? So to say it quickly, the Greeks say when salt spoils, what do you salt it with? The rabbis say the afterbirth of a mule. The Greeks say, what are you talking about? Mules can't have afterbirths. The rabbis say, so yeah, that's your answer? Who says salt spoils? And that's the end of it. It's finished. Now they go on to another topic. So the commentators explain it. The Vilna Gaon explains this in a very brilliant manner. He says the following. He says, what is salt? Salt, there's a word for it in chemistry, but there's different types of substances in the world. There's some substances when you put two things together, it's a conglomerate of two things. Another times you put two things together, it becomes a new substance. Right? Salt, when it's separate, is sodium and chlorine. If you would take sodium or chlorine, it will kill you. It's poison. Either one of them will kill you. But if you put it together, it creates a new substance called salt, which preserves life. You have to have salt in order to be alive. You have to have salt in your food. You need salt to live. So this substance, which are two types of poison, when they're separate, when they come together, they're not separate at all. They're not poisonous at all. They're now very good for us, right? What is the afterbirth of a mule? So a mule is the offspring of a donkey and a horse. Right? A donkey and a horse are very different, even though they're very similar. They look similar. They're similar enough that they can have relations. They're attracted to each other, but they're different enough that they won't. That one cannot impregnate the other, right? And because they would be sterile. They wouldn't be able. If they would have an offspring, the offspring could not have more children. There's no such thing as creating these mules that would have mules. There's no such thing. The only way to make a mule is a donkey and a horse, period. Right? You can't have a mule create a mule. There's no idea like this. So what is it? So symbolically, in Jewish literature, everything symbolizes something. So a horse is a symbol of ego. Right? Kings ride horses. They're very handsome, very beautiful animals. Right? It shows your ego. You're strong, powerful. You know, I'm a self-made man. I'm handsome. Right? That's a horse. And what's a donkey? A donkey's stubborn. He's not so handsome. But he does what he wants to do. You want a donkey to stand up? He doesn't want to stand up. He ain't gonna. Right? If he wants to, you want him to lay down, he's not going to unless he wants to. You want him to go up the hill, he won't unless he wants to. A donkey does what he wants. That's called, in our ideas, we consider that the epitome of taiva. Taiva is our desires. Our desires for our desires. I want to eat. I don't care what you say. I'm going to eat. I want to sleep now. I don't care that it's time to go somewhere or do something. I want to sleep. Right? I do my desires. So you take something that is the epitome of ego and you marry it together with something that's the epitome of sensual desire, and you create this animal that one thing it can't do is give. It can't have children. It can't give. All it can do is take. Right? That's what it is. Then now we're defining our terms. Salt is two types of poison put together and it preserves you. A mule is two types of animals. Each animal has positives and negatives, but the negatives that we're dealing with is unbridled ego. With a horse, it's handsome, right? It's the king's animal, and a donkey, which does what it wants to do and nothing else, and which shows desires. You put those two together, and you have this offspring that can't give. It can't do anything. It can only take, because it's all ego and desire. It can't give. It can only take. So now, when salt spoils, what do you salt it with? The Greeks say, you Jews, you didn't do your deal. God said, you keep the Torah, I'll take care of you. Well, you didn't keep the Torah. Right? God threw you out of Israel. And he destroyed the temple. So, right, the salt spoiled. Right? You didn't do what you're supposed to do. The covenant of salt is spoiled. And therefore, what are you going to salt it with? What are you going to use to preserve your relationship with God? Because you've destroyed it now. There's the Greeks telling the Jews. So the Jews says, oh, don't worry about it. We will use the afterbirth of a mule. And they say, what do you mean an afterbirth? There's no such thing as an afterbirth of a mule, because a mule can't have children. So rabbis say, no, that's not what we meant. A mule is a symbol of unbridled ego and unbridled sensuality. That represents the Jewish people when they're sinning. When the Jews are not keeping their covenant, their deal with God, to follow the rules, right, to follow the covenant, and then God sends us out, we're like the afterbirth of a mule, because we're either so egotistical that we're not going to listen to God, or we're so tied into our desires that we don't want to listen to God. So then we can't give. We can't do what we're supposed to do anymore. So he said that. So therefore, that's why we sinned. But the afterbirth of a mule, right, will save us. What does it mean that? That means our children, right? And they said, but mules can't have afterbirths. Mules, people, if you really are that bad, if the Jews are really that bad, your children aren't going to save you. So the answer the rabbis say is, no, we only believe that we are mules. Really, we're not mules. We're the children of angels. The Jewish people are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, yes, we made mistakes, but we're not the offspring of mules. We're the offspring of great people. And therefore, if we messed up, our children will bring us back. Our children will save the Jewish people, right? And that's what it means when they say, but a mule can't have an afterbirth. Oh, and then who says that salt can spoil? That's the rabbis say back, because our children will save us. They will do it. So it talks about the power of the next nation. So here, when we talk about the sacrifice having salt on it, it's telling you the salt represents this idea of human beings and God being very different. Separately, human beings and God are poison to each other. God is totally spiritual. We're physical. But it doesn't jive. It doesn't work together. It's either, he's spiritual and we're spiritual, or we're physical and he's physical. And then we can get together. But we're not. He's spiritual and we're physical. He's way up here and we're way down here. Right? But if we have a covenant, an agreement where we come together, we act spiritually, and God helps us physically, then that makes salt. That's a preservative. That preserves the Jewish people. So therefore, in every sacrifice, the purpose of the sacrifice is to bring us close to God. We put salt, because salt reminds us of this idea that separate from God, we're poison to each other, but together with God, we preserve life. And that's really what the message is. That's really what it's trying to tell us, that every sacrifice that we give does it in exactly that manner, that it gives us that ability to sustain ourselves and the Jewish people. And we keep that in mind, because ultimately, even if we sin, and even if we can't offer sacrifices like today, right? Here we are 2,000 years after the second temple is destroyed, and we still don't have it again. We don't have the temple. That means we're still sinning. We're still doing whatever it was we did wrong then, we're doing wrong today. Right? So how come after 2,000 years God doesn't throw us out? Salt is spoiled, right? If the Greeks thought it was spoiled, then the Americans would certainly think it's spoiled. 2,000 years has gone by, right? If the Greeks thought way back then that the covenant's over, then for sure today they would say, you've been running around the world being chased by us for 2,000 years. Isn't it time that you came to the realization, you crazy Jews, you blew it? It's over? You didn't do what you're supposed to do for 2,000 years. You've been running around like this. And we say no. We blew it, but we never blew the whole thing. The relationship is always there. Salt cannot spoil. Salt, right, is always a preservative, and it will preserve us. And we will come back, and we will have that relationship, and we will have the temple, and we will offer sacrifices. In the meantime, we can't offer sacrifices. We know from King David that King David teaches us in Psalms that prayers are the closest thing we have to sacrifices today. Our prayers are in lieu of sacrifices. In fact, we have morning prayers, shacharis, we have mincha, we have musaf. Those are all names of sacrifices. If you read this parsha, you're going to find all those words, because you have the morning sacrifice, and you have the afternoon sacrifice, and you have the extra sacrifice on Shabbos and holidays. That's called musaf. So we call our prayers by those words, but they're the same words as the sacrifices, because our prayers are in lieu of sacrifices. Every day, the Kohanim gave the morning sacrifice. They gave the continual sacrifices. They gave the afternoon sacrifices. They gave all these sacrifices every single day. Today, we can't do it. So we pray. Our prayers take the place of that. So therefore, we always have that ability. David says, our lips are like cows, meaning our lips take the place of the cows. That we speak the words of prayer, and it's as if we offer a sacrifice. So that's really the message is. Because you'd have to wonder, what's the purpose of the Torah taking so much space to talk about sacrifices? Here we learn about Yitzchak, right? One of the great forefathers. There's not even an entire parsha talking about Yitzchak. Like Yitzchak is almost an afterthought in the Torah. There's so little about him. Sacrifices, they got pages and pages and pages until you're blue in the face already about sacrifices. Right? Every detail, how to do it, where the blood goes here, the blood goes there, you cut it here, the fat goes there, cut off this part, use that part, he eats this, you eat that. It's like, we haven't had sacrifices in 2,000 years, and the Torah takes like this much of the Torah and says it's about sacrifices. Right? Why? Right? The point is that the sacrifices help us become close to God. If it's not by using the animal, it's by using our prayers, and we will come back to it. It's going to happen again. Right? The temple will be rebuilt, and we will be returned, and we will do this again.